Hey everyone, welcome to the instructional video for the Elefante Designs Webshooter kit. I thank you so much for purchasing this kit. Your support helps Elefante Designs keep moving forward onto bigger and better things. Now I designed this kit for one main reason, which was to test my idea of using a paper Chinese yo-yo as the web effect, and I think it turned out pretty well. I saw these years ago in a party store as party favors, passed them up, and never saw them again. Finally, I was able to track them down on Amazon, so if you'd like to achieve the same effect, these are linked in the video description. If you're looking to make the accompanying costume, you can check out our episode of Let's Make on the Elefante Designs YouTube channel where we do exactly that. As for the Webshooter kit, let's jump right in. If you've purchased this kit on Etsy or any other form of purchasing only digital files, you'll need to 3D print them yourself. In a moment, you'll see a variety of 3D printing time lapses that serve as eye candy and the suggested print orientation for each of the pieces. If you've purchased this kit on Shapeways, you won't need to worry about any of the printing details, but you should know that the kit only contains enough parts for one web shooter. So if you're looking to complete your costume, you should pick up a second one. With that being said, cue the eye candy. Take one. Alright, let's take a look at the pieces that go into making the web shooter from the kit. The first piece is what I'm calling the main base. This is the main cuff piece that is the shape of it and goes around your wrist. Next is the second layer of the web shooter, which is more of the normal web shooter shape. Then you have the activation bar here. And the trigger, which is the piece that goes on your palm. Then we have 4 sets of what will be the web shooter cartridge and its harness. Now, I've kind of skipped a step here. As soon as I was printing these, I would glue on the magnets because I was printing them in a set. So each time I ran the printer, it was one cartridge and one harness. So as soon as that came off, I would load the next one on, and then I would start gluing on the magnets. So the next thing that I want to grab after having all these pieces ready and in front of me is just a couple tools that I'm going to use to help clean them up and do some little bit of work before I hit them with some spray paint. So the first thing I have is some sandpaper. This is 320 grit sandpaper. I'm not doing any like major sanding because personally I'm okay with seeing the layer lines in the pieces. This is just to get some of the strings off and clean it up just a little bit before we go to paint. I also have some wire. Now, heavily in this project, you're going to see that I like to use these wires from coat hangers. I get these from my dry cleaner whenever I pick up my dry cleaning, but they're pretty versatile. You can bend them pretty easily. I use them a lot in my 3D printing, and so I'll show you here on camera. The diameter of these is right about 0.075, and that can vary wire to wire because some of them have a coating on them, some of them don't. So usually when I model something, I'll put a hole that's about, depending on how tight I want the hole to be, I think I do about 0.08, 0.085 if I want it to be pretty easy. But so you'll see there's a lot of holes on these pieces. Now they aren't all for wires, but some of them are. So I've made this little tool, looks like this, that I can hold easily in my fingers. That way I can clear out some of these holes before when we go to do test fittings and stuff like that. So I also have this tool, as well as my Leatherman Wave I use. This is awesome for bending the wires and cutting it, and just an all-around good tool. Also on here I have a file which has done me lots of good over the years. So also, instead of the sandpaper, I can use this to clean off pieces or wiggle a piece out or whatever I need it for. First thing we're going to do is just give all of the pieces a really light sanding. If you're printing at home, and I guess depending on what kind of printer you're using, sometimes you get strings I don't know if you can see those there. There's some strings hanging and little loose pieces of plastic that have melted incorrectly. You'll see on these pieces there's a lot of strings in there. And so I just want to get in there and clean some of those out and rough it up a little bit so that it's ready for when I'm going to paint it. And when you're doing this sanding part, you'll find that it's really not that hard or difficult or anything. Um, it's, I mean, you're not getting like really in depth. You're just kind of giving everything a once over. It's kind of like, I kind of in my head compare it to like drying dishes. If you use a drying rack, you dry the plate and you throw it on the rack. It's not like you're trying to make sure there's absolutely no moisture on there. You're just kind of roughing it up, or getting the bulk of it, and the rest will come later. It's during this time too that you probably want to make sure you remove any support material, if any. Okay, once you're all done with the light sanding, next what we're going to do is make sure all of the holes are cleared. That way we don't have any problems with them later. So I'm using this tool that I showed you earlier, and I'm just using this so that I can sort of punch into the holes that we're going to use with this wire later. And to make sure there's no plastic in the way and everything's cleared out and that we won't have any problems later. So the first is on this main cuff here. There are 5 holes that we're going to punch out. The first are these 3 right here in the center. So all I'm going to do is take these pieces and just push them through there, give them a little spin, make sure everything fits nicely. Everything's good in there. And then the next ones are on either side. There's one here and there's one right there. So I'm going to do the same exact thing. Just sort of clear them out, make sure they're okay. Okay, that piece is done. The next one is on this piece. And actually with this one, there's a little bit of explaining that has to be done.
Actually, it doesn't. I was going to explain what this hole in the front of the shooter is for, but I ended up not even using it, so you can just ignore this whole section. You don't even need to clear out this hole.
The next is on the activation bar. Now there's 2 squares right here that have 2 holes each. On the sides of the squares there's a really big hole, and on the front of the squares there's a small hole. The only one that we need to clear out with this wire are these small ones on the front. And then on the activation bar itself there's one on either side, here and here, and we're going to clear those out as well. So we'll just run through there. There we go, and then just these little ones up front. Now with these little ones, they don't go all the way through the block, so you can basically just push as hard as you want, make sure you get to the end, twist it around a little bit, and then you've cleared out what is most in there. Really doesn't matter how deep these go. You don't need a crazy tunnel in there, just at least a little bit cleared out. Next is the trigger. Now the trigger, the 2 holes that we're looking to clear are these 2 right here. Now depending on what you've printed this in and how you've printed this can be very delicate. You can even see mine bends just a little bit already, so you got to be really careful with this piece. What I do is I pinch right here with my thumb and first finger, and then I'm going to push that wire in there to make sure those holes are clear. And now you'll see that my tool doesn't make it all the way through. So on this one, on both of those holes, I'm going to go from either side just to make sure everything's clear and we don't have any issues down the line. Last but not least is the cartridges. Now these don't really have holes that a wire is going to go into. There is a set of holes up at the front of the cartridge that I did plan to use little wire pieces with, but I just left them there for aesthetic reasons. The holes that we are going to use are these big ones up front, and they're not going to accept a wire like this, but you can just clear them out because we are going to be gluing something in there depending on which set of cartridges you put in a certain spot. So I'm just going to clear all those out just to be safe. After we finish the sanding and clearing the holes, what we're going to do now is a little bit of a mock assembly. We're just going to put these together loosely, make sure everything's working, make sure we don't have to bend or mold anything. So I've also got right here is my sweatbands for my wrists, if you're following the tutorial that I have on Elefante Designs. if you're not using sweatbands, I think it would look really cool if somebody took this piece and maybe did a spray of like Flex Seal or Plasti Dip or something to give it that rubberized feel. Or you could coat it with, I don't know, like some leather or vinyl or something like that to give that look of sort of the more walk around everyday web shooter that I assume Peter wears underneath his sweatshirt or something like that. So that would be really cool. But for me, I'm going to be doing the homecoming sort of prototype suit, so I'm going to use these red sweatbands. So I know that my wrist is pretty small, and this cuff piece was designed specifically for my wrist. But if it doesn't fit you, we can resize it using a heat gun. If you imagine a line going down the side of the web shooter just after the lip on top, you don't want to heat up the side that has the holes, but you do want to heat on the side that doesn't have any holes. Just get it a little bit warm, enough to that when it's soft, you can use something like a hammer or something curved that you can just barely push up on the side of it, widening it out like this. Once one side looks good, you can do the same thing to the other side until it fits your wrist nicely. Once it fits how you like it, then we can move to the mock assembly. So first thing we're going to do for this mock assembly is we're going to take the main base and we're going to slip one of our sweatbands over it. So this sweatband, I believe, is 2.5 inches tall, something like that. You'll see on mine in a second once I get it centered that it's not supposed to cover the whole entire thing. It's basically supposed to cover that main section of the plastic cuff, and then this little part will stick out at the top, and that's okay, that's what we want. So also to help me in this assembly, I have some sewing pins here. And this is just because we're going to be poking some holes through the sweatband. That way we can make sure everything lines up. So what I'm doing now is just looking from the inside at these holes that match with these ones right here. So just for this mock assembly, I'm only going to put a couple in to make sure everything's sitting correctly and nicely. So I think what I'm going to do is maybe these 4 here, 1, 2, 3, and 4 on both sides, just so that we can get everything lined up. So I'm reaching in and I'm pushing that pin in and I'm just letting it come out of the top of the sweatband. I'm just going to leave it like that. Alright, now that those pins are in there and we look like we're going to some strange rock concert or something, please be careful with these pins. It always freaks me out when I have these pins because I just hate getting pricked and it's just awful. So please be careful when you've got it like this, but it's just to sort of show us how this is all going to get layered, make sure everything fits together. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get a piece of our wire, the same wire that we used to make this tool that I showed you from the dry cleaning hangers, and I'm going to chop a piece of this off, but a long piece. That way, because I'm not going to put it on right now. I already know that the cuff fits. I just want to make sure that all these pieces fit together. That way I don't have to do anything after painting and then paint over that again. So I just have this long piece of wire. And first thing I'm going to do is make sure that this goes into the activation bar. And you'll see that with these 2 holes on the sides, it's going to be a little bit of a tight fit, but it's going to go all the way through and it should connect those 2 holes. Now, depending on what filament and what material you've done it in, this is a little bit bendy in the middle because it's a little bit thinner, so be careful for that. But I'm just making sure that it goes through both, and then I'm going to pull it out again because we're going to do the same thing on these 2 holes on the main cuff right there and there. So these ones should also line up with the straight bar like that. So how I'm going to do this basically is we're going to line up all those 4 holes there, because this activation bar, when we're done, it should move like this. Okay, so I'm basically going to line all this up and try to stick it through all 4 of those holes. So you see, first I've got it through the activation bar right here. Then it's going to go through the same side of the first cuff, sticking it through there. Then the other side of the main cuff, and then out the other side of the activation bar. It's a little bit of a tight fit. There we go. Okay, and I mean, it's not crazy important for this sort of mock assembly right now because we're just making sure everything fits, but when you do put all this together, make sure that the 2 dots, the 2 holes on the front of these boxes, is facing where your fingers are going to be, because that has to do with our trigger system, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, so I've got it like this, and now you can see that this bar is going to move like this. That's going to be our sort of trigger assembly for how Peter would shoot these webs out. Now, already when I do this, I'm feeling a bit of scratchiness in there, so I'm going to work it back and forth, make sure that flows okay. I don't want to do it too much because I don't want this to be flapping around when I'm wearing it. So a little bit is okay, but you just want to make sure that it goes semi-smoothly. Okay, so the next part of our assembly is going to be the second layer of the cuff. Now you see all these holes that you probably remember from the first layer of the cuff, and that's because later we're going to sew through all these different layers. So this is going to match up with the pins that we stuck it through the sweatband. So remember, I put them in the second layer, or I'm sorry, the second row down on either side. So right now I'm just going to try to line those up in the same holes. That way when we drop this second layer of the cuff, it fits. What I'm doing to line these up is I'm kind of looking in here using this light that I have to shine through the piece. That way I can see the holes, and then I'm from the inside I'm pulling the pins out, and I'm sort of using that to drive through in to find the right hole. So I'll try to show you on this one. This one's got to go over there. There we go. And then once it's there, I push it all the way out so it sticks out the top side there. So now that's lined up, you can get a little better sense for how this thing is going to sit. Because if you were paying attention, you'll see that on the bottom of the Webshooter cartridges, you have the same holes, right? So we're going to do the same thing with this one. We're going to set them on those pins. That way we can make sure everything looks right. What's important to look at here is the side of the harness. So on one side we have a long angled piece and a small hole, and on the other side we have a big hole and a short angled piece. So this big hole and the short angled piece are going to go up front on the side that your fingers are on, like this. Okay, and so I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the pins in the other piece, just to try to set them on there and make sure everything looks right. Now we get like what is the best representation so far of what this web shooter is going to look like. So obviously the cartridges are going to sit on there on either side. Your hand's going to go through the middle, and we're going to assemble what is to be this trigger shape at the front in just a second here. But you can kind of see how this thing is going to fit together. Looks pretty cool. Okay, since we've got that sort of mock assembly done, we're going to work on what are going to be the bars for the trigger. So I basically stripped down the assembly to just these two pieces, the activation bar and the main cuff. I still have them connected with this bar here, but actually I'm going to trim this down because I'm going to use part of it for this next part of the assembly. So I'm just going to slip it to one side. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm not going to use this in the final. And I'm just going to trim it like right there. We're basically going to use this bar, or a couple of these maybe, to assemble what is going to be the bars for this trigger. Now, to show you this, it's better to show you the final product first. And you can see from this that when I pull on the trigger, it moves the activation bar back and forth. Now, it's a really small part of this, but I really wanted to grab that because when I was looking for reference, it's pretty hard to find reference of these, at least when I was making it. So I came across this video from behind the scenes of Spider-Man Homecoming, and it's Tom Holland showing off the prop web shooters that he's wearing. And you'll see in this clip that it's a slowed down version of it, but he's pulling on this trigger piece and it actually moves what I believe to be this activation bar. So I really wanted to make sure I got that movement in there, and that's what we're going to be creating right now. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to notice the three holes that we cleared out earlier, here, here, and here, from the main cuff. Just going to be sticking this wire straight in there. Now you don't want to go in too far because you notice that the hole goes all the way through the main cuff. So you don't want to be poking into the activator bar, you just want it barely there on the surface. That way the activation bar can still move. So
Right about now is when I start to ramble and no longer make sense, even to myself. But as I understand it now, you're trying to bend the bars into a shape like this, or like this. Both of them will give you a similar movement. Next, it's time to paint. First, I made a quick hanging rig to spray all the parts without needing to touch them. I started with a couple coats of basic primer. Normally, I use this metallic spray paint from Valspar that has a nice nickel finish. It's my favorite all-time metallic spray paint and can have a very realistic finish. I went to the store to buy some and all they had was this. They swore, "It's the same stuff, it's just a new can design." Well, it's not the same. I don't like it. It's too shiny. So to correct this, I used some old clear coat I had to dull down the shine. Here's a comparison of with and without the clear coat.
Alright, now that we're all done with painting, I've got our pieces here and we need to assemble them so that we can sew them together. You might have some of these strings around from the paint. Just scratch those off. Alright, first thing we're going to do is take our red sweatband and drape it over the first part of the cuff. Make sure it lines up all nice. You don't have to exactly place the up and down movement yet because we're going to be moving this around quite a bit. So first thing we want to do, for my sweatbands, they have this big logo right here in the middle. And so I wanted to put those underneath what is going to be the second part of the base like this. The only thing to watch out for is that when you're sewing this, there is a big logo here which is embroidered, so it's kind of hard to get a needle through that. I'll show you in a bit using some pliers to poke a needle through that or something. So we've got our sweatband draped over like this, and what we're going to do is put on the two Webshooter cartridges that go on the back here. Now how I chose to line them up is by lining up this line of the cartridge with the inside line of the cuff, which is right there. So I would say probably, I don't know, probably like that, just like that is where I have mine. Of course, you can place them wherever you want. In different pictures, sometimes they do look a little bit closer because there's one that goes here as well, just like that. So in some of the pictures that I saw, they look like they're pretty close together here on the outside, but I think I'm going to put mine about here because it looks like, at least what I remember from the movie, that's about where they are. So using this plastic cuff on the inside is how I was sort of spacing out my Webshooter cartridges. So also having these pieces, you want to have some elastic or black like nylon webbing or something. I'm using elastic just because I like this sort of pattern that's on there of ribs, and it stretches also. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these pieces and pin this elastic down. So I know that the elastic and the cartridge are about the same size. You see right there. They're about the same length. So I'm going to line this up how I want it, which I think is right. I'm going to call it right there. So holding this in place on the red sweatband, basically I'm just going to line up this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to line up the cartridge, but I'm going to scoot it back more so I have some room. So just trying to look at it here. I'm going to say right there is good. So I'm going to hold that cartridge. I'm going to put this elastic lined up with that. And then now I'm going to basically shift my hand so that I hold the position with the elastic and not with the cartridge itself. And then I'm just going to pin it right there so I can hold it until I'm ready for it. There's one. Do the same thing with the other side. I'm going to call it right there maybe. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And you know, these don't have to be exact or anything, it's just kind of personal preference. Gonna pin it right here. Come on now. There it is, pinned on there, nice. And so I don't care too much if they swivel around like this because I know I just want to have it perpendicular to the red sweatband when I do sew this on there. And also a good note is that I'm putting because this elastic is going to basically wrap around the red sweatband and come back and meet its other side here. So I'm putting the loose ends what is going to be underneath the web shooter. That way, even on the inside, there's nothing that'll like pick or catch or something. So just a tip from me to you. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to scoot the red sweatband around. So the reason why I'm pinning these on is because obviously I can't sew through them right now because there's a big old plastic thing underneath it. So what I have to do is basically take this sweatband and just scoot it over like this until the elastic is in the open arch, basically this open section where there's no plastic cuff. So now that I've scooted this one over, I'm going to try to keep this one out of the way. I'm going to wrap it inside, fold it at the end, and fold it around till it comes back on itself. You see that? Gives us a nice base for our cartridge harness. And then I'm basically just going to hold this in place and pin it. I'm going to use this pin that I already have right here. And you know what? I might need to do 2 pins on this. Be careful you don't poke your fingers. That really freaks me out every time it happens. There we go. There's one. You know, we'll be good with one. So now what I'm going to do is decide which of my cartridges I want to be on this place. If you're like me, usually I put the best looking ones on the front of the piece. So I'm going to choose, that one looks pretty good. That one does too. So those will be the front ones, and yeah, these two will be the back ones. So we don't need the cartridge in right now. We just need to work with the harness, but you want to pay attention to how the harness sits, because these, I mean, you can put them in backwards, but it looks weird because you got this big old space, and then this side doesn't sit down as flat as it should. So through the research that I did, it seems like the cartridges that are on the front have this channel on the downward side like this, and then when it turns around to the other side of the hand, they're flipped around, from what I found. So I'm going to put mine on like this to match the research that I did. So we don't need this right now, but so just to note, if you are doing that, the bigger hole would be on what is the bottom of the cuff, like this, and the smaller hole would be at the top. But remember, when we come around to the front and we sew these ones on, they're going to be flipped around. Okay, so I'm going to hold this basically on the spot that I want it, and here you got to put a good amount of pressure because I'm going to pull this pin out. That way it sits flat. So I'm just trying to line it up and make sure it sits correctly. There we go, and I'm going to pull this pin out and basically pin back through these holes in the harness, almost like when we were doing that mock assembly. So I'm going to pin there first because I know it'll hold both of the layers. Please don't poke me, please don't poke me. Okay, good. And now I'm basically going to pin it in a bunch of different spots, that way I know it's holding where it should be. There we go. Please don't poke me. There we go. Now these are just to hold it in place because we're going to be sewing this too, basically through all of these layers. So yeah, you can see the pins sort of in the back there, and they're just holding that harness in place. Now these don't have to be perfect, and depending on how tight you pull your thread and how you sew it, it's going to wiggle around a little bit, but it's not too big of an issue. Okay, now that that's pinned in place, I'm going to grab a hand sewing needle and I'm going to thread on some black thread. Now, out of the needles that I have, I'm using one that's generally short because when you get to the front side, you're basically doing this not in the center, so you're really close to the edges here where it's curved. And so longer needles won't be able to stand up straight and get into the hole at the right angle when you're way tucked in here in the curves. So I'm using this shorter one to make sure I can, well, at least to help me a little bit so I can wiggle up in there when we switch to the front side. So go ahead and thread on your black thread. Ay, ay, ay. Big hands, little needle. Do not mix well. There we go. Alright. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Stay tuned. Ha! I win because I have fingers and a brain. Okay, I'm pulling out my thread. I'm not getting too much. You really only need maybe just a little bit over 12 inches. And I'm doing one of those like sort of double layered ones. I don't know what that's called. I'm doing it though. Alright. Make sure you tie off the knot, because that would be bad if you didn't. There it is. There we go. Alright, knot tied. And so the reason I do whatever this like sort of double thing of thread is because actually I'll show you right now. When I start off, now for this one specifically, when I'm starting off I like to just follow a pattern, that way they're sort of all done consistently. So I start on the side that has the big hole here, and I'm going to start in this hole right here, basically the side with the big hole in the middle. I'm going to go back here and then I'm going to tie it off in a knot as I come back this direction. After I come back this direction, I'm basically doing the outside of this square. Then I'm bringing it to the middle, back to the side. From here, I'm going to go down to the other side square, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go around the outside. I'm going to bring it into the middle. And then, depending on how the thread is there, I might have to bring it back one and then here again, because I'm basically going to bring it to this one and then underneath, because this is the top where the magnet is. I'm going to go underneath to this one, bring it back up right to where I started. That way it's all in the same place, and I'll tell you why that's important in a bit. So I'm going to start it right here, and one of the things that I do in the beginning, I start right here. Come on now. There we go. And please be very careful if you're doing this, and if you're young, please get a parent's approval or guidance. Supervision is always good. So I'm going to pull through there. And now here's where it can be kind of hard, because now this needle, which is on the inside, has to come back out through that top hole, which can be a little weird. So what I did, and I cannot believe I'm advising someone else to do this because I absolutely hate it, because you get your fingers poked a lot. What I did is I take a pin and I basically pin it in, trying to stay as straight as I can perpendicular to the cuff. I pin it in right on that spot. Right? I squeeze it nice and tight. That way I have a representation of where that hole is on this side. Alright? So I'm going to pull this close, but not all the way through, because I still want to have a little bit of loop on this side, just for this first one here. So I'm going to pull just a little bit. That's good enough. Okay. On the inside, I see this pin that I have here. That's very hard for you guys to see. Let's try this out. You guys remember mouse pads? Okay. So I know that this front pin is the one that I need to line up with, and with these first couple harnesses it's actually easier because it's mostly soft, so you can pull on it and get a better look in there. Let's see if that gets us a good look. So what I'm going to do is basically take my needle with the thread on it and poke it right at the base of that needle, trying to keep these two lined up as most as I can. So I'm basically pinching both the sewing pin from this side and the needle with the thread on it together. That way I keep them at the same angle, and then I'm pushing up. Come on now. Once the needle with the thread gets in there, you can pull this one out a little bit, so you try not to pinch your fingers. Pull the pin out a little bit, and then basically you just want to push this needle until you can find and fit to the hole in the top here. So it's really small, but I just saw the tip of that needle come through. As soon as that needle comes through, pull this one out, because I don't want you to pinch your fingers, because I absolutely hate that. I will say that forever and ever and ever. But now that it's come through, I can pinch the top of it, be very careful, and I can pull on it. Now from here, if I pull, this doesn't happen when you do the front harnesses, but on this back one, since it's not rigid on the back, sometimes it gets a little bit tangled, so I'm going to put my thumb in between the two sections of the thread and just tighten it basically over my thumb until it gets close. That way I can watch it and it won't get tangled on itself. Okay, so I'm going to pull my thumb out. I'm going to pull this through. And then on the top side, just for this first one, to tie it off, I've come out of this hole here in the bottom corner, and now, remember our thread is double layered because I tied a knot there. I'm basically going to go through the layers, kind of like I'm tying it, but not exactly. So I'm going through that little loop that I left, and now I'm going to pull it tight. And you'll see that it actually holds on there pretty well. So from there, I'm going to try to tighten it as much as I can. Get these little threads out of the way. There we go. Pull it nice and tight. Now I can continue to sew knowing that that is secure. It's anchored to itself basically. So from here you basically just want to follow that pattern that I talked about, or whatever pattern really, just as long as it works for you. And just sew around the entire harness until you get back done with the other side. Okay, so now when you've gone all the way around, basically I ended up at this hole right here, which is right next to the magnet. I did that hole, I went into the bracer, that way I could cross the magnet on the inside, and now I've come out of this hole right here, just right through the middle. So now what I'm going to do is basically thread my way back to where I started it. Okay, so since I'm coming out of this hole, I actually want to go back in. So I'm going to pull this one tight, and just how when we started it, I'm not going to pull all the way. So I'm going to go back in this hole, but I'm going to leave a loop on this outside part. Okay, so pulling through a little bit, but I'm leaving this loop out here. I'm going to leave some of this loop. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller so it's not terribly in the way. And then I'm going to go back up through the same hole that I just came down through, which is easy now that I can see the string coming out of it. Coming back up through that hole. I need something to push with. There we go. Okay, now basically I'm going to try to identify which one of these sides of the circle is the one that's going in and which one's coming out, and I'm basically going to tie this, just like a shoelace, to the one that's going in. So I know that it's this side. I'm basically just tying this in a knot. So I'm pulling those, going back through here, and then once it's tied like that, I can just pull this as tight as I can, right down in there. So you see, just like that. Let me get that thread out of the way. It might be stuck in there. There we go. Okay, so I'm pulling on this. I don't want to break the thread, but I want it to be pretty tight on there so it doesn't move around. Okay, so now what I like to do, is I use some super glue. I know, right? Super glue for sewing, but I do this all the time. So right now I'm using this Gorilla Glue super glue. This is the liquid stuff, and I get the liquid on purpose because I want it to seep into where I'm dabbing it on. Right from where I've tied those threads off, I'm going to lay this over the side here. Try to get everything out of the way nice and clean. And I'm going to get my super glue and just get a little tiny dot right on the end of it, and I'm just going to drip that right into where we've tied all those things down. So I'm going to build up that drip at the end and just drop it right on there. And then I'm going to let it sit because I want it to seep in and sort of seep around basically the threads and just lock them in place. I usually push my finger on there too, just to like really push it down, and usually that helps it dry some. So after that, I'm just going to get a pair of scissors, and I'm just going to clip the rest of the threads, the excess, off because we don't need it now because it's all glued in there. Alright. You might want to wait a couple minutes for that glue just really to set, or if you want to take a tissue and rub it on there just so you don't glue pieces down. But then you should be able to get your cartridge in there with the magnet. So once you've done one, you're going to shimmy this over to the other one, just like we did before, and do the whole process again. Ta-da! Once you've got those sewn on and all the pieces are in there good, we'll be able to move on to sewing on what are the front pieces. So what we're going to be doing is basically the same thing we just did, but with more layers. So now that we have these two pieces on, we're going to be sewing through the main cuff, through the red sweatband, through the second part of the cuff, and through two harnesses that we're going to sew on either side, right here and right here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just use some sewing pins to make sure everything's lined up and good. So I'm going to start, I think, just with all the corner holes right here, and the same with the other side, just to make sure everything sits nice and is lined up with the holes through all the different layers. There we go. Now that those are in, we can drop on the next parts of the layer. So I'm going to take the second part of the cuff and I'm going to drop it onto these pins, making sure that the pins go in the same holes that I put them through in the main cuff and through the red sweatband. Alright, I talked about the holes on each side of the harness and how I thought they go on compared to the reference pictures that I found. So if you're following what I did and what I found in my reference pictures, the bigger hole is going to go on the top side, basically where the web comes out of the web shooter, so like this. Now this is important because when we get our final assembly together, there are some wires that plug basically from the side of the harness. They go into a little loop and they go right into the activation bar. And so that's why it's important that the harness, the bigger hole, goes up front this time. Okay, so let's thread these on the same way we did the other cuff. So now we have all of our layers like this. And for me it was quite important, one, that the bigger holes were on top with the harnesses for those wires I was showing you, and also that I had just a little bit of red to play with down here at the bottom. So I made sure that those were the right length for that. So once you're looking at it and everything looks good, you don't see the logo anywhere, you got the right clearances and whatnot, it's time to sew. Now actually to sew, There's one thing you have to be careful of, and that's when you work from one side to the other. Once you get to the second side, the first side will be clamped down over what is the soft layer of the sweatband, and these holes aren't going to line up exactly. So when you're sewing that, you're going to basically need to sort of clamp down with your hands on that side to sort of even it out. I don't know if you can see that little bit of movement, but that's really important because you don't want it to sit lopsided, and you want to make sure that when you're sewing through the second side, the holes are lined up so you're not sort of just poking right into plastic. So since I'm only sewing one side at a time, I'm actually going to take one of the harnesses off. And I'm going to thread my needle. So I've got the same black thread that I used last time and the same needle. Basically, we're just going to do the same thing that we did for the past two cartridge harnesses. We're going to be sewing through all the different layers. Now, when you're sewing this main piece on, there are pros and cons. One of the pros is that you don't have to use the pins as much as you did last time to let you know where the holes are on the other side, because you can see the holes on the inside because the main cuff is there this time. One of the cons is that now you have all these layers that you have to try to line up that we didn't have to deal with last time. Last time we only had one set of holes and we had to sew through some layers of fabric. This time we have what are 3 sets of holes and 1 layer of fabric. So just be mindful of what you're doing and try to be patient if you run into any obstacles. I'm going to follow or try to follow the same pattern that I did last time, just because I like to do that. You don't have to, but that's just how I handle this. Now another thing you have to watch for, which I mentioned earlier, was when you're sewing through that white emblem that's on the sweatband. It's a lot thicker than the sweatband, and it's definitely harder to get a needle through when you're doing it by hand, especially a small needle like this. So sometimes I'll use a pair of pliers when I'm pretty sure I'm lined up with the holes, and I'll just try to give it a little extra push and pull using the pliers. That way I'm not hurting my fingers, and I make sure I'm still getting it through that thicker emblem. And once you're done with that side, making sure the glue is dry and not making the same mistake that I did, you can do your test fit and move on to the next side. I've noticed that the more I progress through the second side, the more I'm going to be putting the needle through the holes at an angle, and hopefully I can demonstrate this for the camera, but you'll see that when it fits in, it's no longer perpendicular because it's not scrunched up against the cuff as the other side was. So you'll see that this needle here is going at a little bit more of an angle than it was before. And that's totally fine. The only reason I'm saying is just so that you can be mindful of while you're sewing, they're going to move around a little bit. And you should adjust for that so you don't have any hard times trying to get the needle to pass through all of the right holes as you're sewing. And once that glue is dry, now your harnesses are affixed to the Webshooter. So we can throw on our cartridges, make sure they all sit nicely, and there we go. Next thing we're going to do is get our piece of wire that we're going to use as our hinges, and we're going to be attaching the activation bar. Now remember, when we put on the activation bar, we want the 2 holes on the front of these blocks to be facing outwards, and then these ones will be where the wires will go to go into the side of the harnesses right there. So what I'm going to do first is basically just line this up, stick this wire through one side of the hinge. Let's make sure we get it all cleared out. Get it through the hinge, and basically just line it up flush. I'm gonna get this activation bar in the middle, and I'm gonna take the wire out just enough to where I know I want to clip it on this side. And actually what I'm going to do is not anything I would advise anyone to do, and that is actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to measure this with my fingers. So I've got it lined up to just about where I want it. I'm going to pinch on the wire here and I'm going to pull it out, making sure I hold that position. Then I'm going to grab my cutters, whatever I'm using to cut this wire, and I'm going to glance down into there and try to line up the claws with the mark that I'm holding. I think it's about right there. Now be very careful when you're cutting these wires because they can go flying, so I'm going to try to shoot mine down. There we go. Then I'm going to take this little piece and test fit it to make sure it's a good length to go in the hinge. There we go. So that actually does look like a pretty good size. So I'm going to take that out and I'm going to cut one the exact same size with the rest of my wire here. That way we have one for the other side as well. There's one side and there is the other. Now to test if this is on correctly, and take a look from the front and try to make sure the activation bar isn't squished or being spread too much, because it is very thin in the center section. And then if you're looking for a web shooter that is dynamic, just make sure that that bar moves back and forth like this. And if it gets a little bit stuck, you can kind of work it a little bit, sand down a little bit of these edges. If it's too much, make sure that it moves back and forth like this. Okay, next step after that is to grab some wire, preferably black coated wire like this one. This one's generally thick. It comes to about 0.105-ish inches in diameter. I pulled this out of a cable that has two that are stuck together like this. I can't remember what kind of cable it was, but I just cut off a section, I pulled them apart, and then I cut these to the right size that I wanted. So where these are going to go is on either side of the web shooter. There's going to be a piece of the wire that goes into the activation bar on the holes on the side, and then a piece, the other side of that wire is going to curve around and it's going to fit into the hole on the side of the cartridge harness. Now this can be a little bit difficult to do, especially when this wire is pretty stiff. So I'm going to kind of work it in my hands into a little bit of a fold like this, just to give us some leeway. And you also want to make sure that the holes on the cartridge harness are cleared out nice and good, and that when you shove the wire in there, you have a good spot that you can glue it from. Now, on my first web shooter, it actually helped out a lot that I pulled out the little copper cables that are inside. This can be kind of hard to do, but if you strip the ends of that and maybe use some pliers, you can pull on those little copper wires on the inside and just try to pull out as much as you can. You're pulling out the bulk of what is inside these wires. That way they can flex a little bit better. So basically the best way to do this that I've found is to the side of the wire that goes into the harness. I'm actually going to cut a little bit of an angle off of it. So I mean, it's not exactly 45 degrees, but I'm just cutting a little snippet off like that to make sure it'll fit well into the harness, and also that it doesn't get in the way of the cartridge once you've got it in the harness and everything is glued down. So I'm just checking to see if that's going to fit right there, and then I'm just going to push it into this other hole in the activation bar like that. So right now I'm just test fitting to make sure everything sits well, and then I'm going to be gluing everything in. I'm going to try to keep everything in place. I'm only going to pull one wire out at a time just so I can dab some of that same super glue in there. And then I'm going to put it right back into its place to make sure that it fits exactly how I did in my little test fitting there. Now once the wires are in, you might find that they're a little bit more stiff than you'd like them to be, and they're going to act like a little bit of a spring and hold the activation bar out. But we want it to sit in close like this. So what you can do after the glue is set and everything is you can hold the activation bar with one hand and take the tip of a lighter and just barely roast the corner of this wire. Now as I roast it, I'm going to make sure I hold on to the activation bar, give it a little bit of a toast, and then leave it. Now once it cools, it's going to hold this shape that I'm giving it right now. So if you want to shape it a little bit, be careful that it's hot, You can give it a little bit of a curve or a bend or a fold or something. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and this heat basically is going to help that wire stay in shape to sort of act as a spring to keep it closed. Okay, and once it's cooled down, you should see that the activation bar sits closer to the actual shooter, but it's still able to move.
Now for the paper web effect. Using a drill bit about the same size as the Chinese yo-yo's plastic tube, I cleared out the opening on the front of the shooter. Mine fit pretty snug, but if yours doesn't, you could wrap the plastic tube with tape to build up the size until it fits nicely. And now that it's secure, you might as well test it out, for science.
And once you're done with that, now would be a good time to turn back the video and do the same thing for the other side, which will give you 2 web shooters. Now the easiest way to put these on is to hold the activation bar and the web shooter basically on top and bottom. Your hand is going to stretch back on this piece right here, and then you can slip your wrist in and it sits just like that.
To finish these off, I decided to give them a bit of a weathered and used effect by randomly spraying some matte black paint onto the finished assembly. I also used some paper to give me some sharp lines like this. And shoot a drop. Actually, don't drop these, you just finished them. And that's the construction of the web shooter. Now personally, I don't really use the trigger because I'd like to keep my palm unobstructed if I'm going to climb or do a handstand or something. And the web I usually keep in my hoodie pocket so that it's nearby and ready for web slinging. If you followed along and built your own, I would love to see it. Send me a picture of your hard work to checkoutmyelefantedesign@gmail.com. Thank you so much again for purchasing this kit and supporting Elefante Designs. I hope you had fun building. I know I have. Until next time, stay awesome.